when the sky is high. No reason to stay around. Pick your hands and you can touch and fly.
Hello, welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker, and welcome to March, when we celebrate Women's History Month, International Women's Day on March 8th, which is why I'm wearing my purple today, and which also marks the beginning of Worldwide Women of Aviation Week, as the anniversary of the first female licensed pilot, Raymond de la Roche, on March 8th, 1910. In February, the Aviatrix Book Club discussed the Happy Bottom Riding Club about Pancho Barnes, one of the original 99s, aviation's early pioneering women, led by their first president, Amelia Earhart. This month, I'm talking with a few authors whose work celebrates the women who flew for their countries during World War II. And I'm thrilled to announce that the Aviatrix Book Review website is now live. There you'll find all the books we're talking about today, along with hundreds of other books featuring women in aviation history, as well as contemporary stories in a range of genres for all ages. I'll also be posting short pieces on our blog on the website all this month featuring various women in aviation history written by several of our authors, including my guest today. She is the author of 14 novels, which have earned a long list of literary awards. She was a writer of Arthurian legend first, but after being introduced to aviation through her husband and earning her private pilot's license, her focus shifted to more modern historical fiction, much of which features women pilots and is set in World War II. These books bring that period of history to life, educating us about our women pioneers in aviation through adventure-filled stories, all of which are based on her meticulous research of real people and real events. She is perhaps best known for her young adult novel, Codename Verity, which hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list in March of 2020. But that book is just one of several works that she's written since then that feature the women who flew for the British Air Transport Auxiliary, the Russian Night Witches, the German Luftwaffe as test pilots, and she has even written a book about a couple of 1920s aerobatic performers and wingwalkers. In honor of Women's History Month, I invited her to share this rich history and her work with us. You can find her at her website, elizabethwein.com. Elizabeth Wein, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I am so excited to talk to you. I've had so much fun talking to all of our authors, but you bring a special combination of passions for me, both for aviation and for writing for children and young adults. And not just any YA author, you are the YA author. Anytime anyone in the YA world finds out that I'm a pilot writing about girls who learn how to fly, they say, have you read Elizabeth Wein's work? So I'm super excited. You have so much to teach us both about women in aviation history and about writing. But first, I wanted to know how you were introduced to aviation, because you were a writer first, right?
I was a writer first. I guess I really like to think that I was always interested in aviation. And when my husband came along, he actually was working, when I met him, on a private pilot's license. And that kind of made me aware that, oh, maybe people can do this. But it wasn't something new. I loved a series by K.M. Payton called Flambards, which was a young adult book when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, but also made into a television series. And it was set around World War I, and it had this aircraft designer, and all the planes that they used in it were little models. And another kind of mainstream thing that I really loved was The Rocketeer, which is a Disney movie, live action Disney movie that was made in kind of the early 90s, I think, and was based on a really racy graphic novel, but they cleaned it up. And it's set in the 1930s in Los Angeles, and it's this barnstormer who gets a jetpack. And I can remember loving this movie. It's like it's still on my top 10 favorite movies. When I was a graduate student in the folklore department at the University of Pennsylvania. So I had that bug before I met my husband. And then when I met him, we did a lot of our courting in small aircraft. And
That's so great.
famously went to visit a mutual friend who was working on a PhD in anthropology and ethnomusicology and was doing her field work in Kenya. And we went to visit her there and flew from Nairobi to the coast to visit our friend in a what was it? I think it was a 172.
What an incredible adventure. I'm so
Yeah.
jealous.
it was amazing.
How long did it take?
I don't know. I think it took about 2 hours. I mean, we did it. I don't really remember. We did it in one hop. He had to get a Kenyan pilot. I didn't know then what I know now, but he had about 72 hours flight time when we did this. and he had to do like a conversion course. It was the first time he'd ever flown with a variable pitch prop, and it also had this like jumped up engine to cope with the high altitude. So he had to learn some stuff that he hadn't learned before, including like how to land in the middle of the savannah. And I was just kind of like, oh yeah, sure, it'll all be fine. And and we had to kind of like, we had to carry all our belongings in like a plastic bag, and because we had to carry so much water with us in case we had to make an emergency landing, because there was no radio contact.
Oh.
So you were out there on your own, basically.
Oh my God.
So, but I was blissfully unaware, and we stayed for like 2 weeks in the flying club at Wilson Airport outside Nairobi, which is where all the scenes in Out of Africa are filmed, and in between times we went flying out over the Great Rift Valley, and it was like living a scene from Out of Africa. It was really, really amazing.
That is fantastic. I hope you have a lot of pictures.
Well, it was 1994, I think. And
yeah.
I mean, I have pictures, but they're all on film. So I took 4 rolls of film, which is like 120 pictures or something. Yeah. And it's not, it's like I would have 1,000 pictures if I went now.
I know. And so you had your private pilot's license then or no?
No, I did not. And we sort of had this plan that we were going to fly across America, coast to coast. This is like the big plan. And we were thinking about maybe doing that in 1997. And instead, we had our first child. And we still haven't done this. And when I sold the rights to my second novel in 2001, I spent that money on flying lessons here in Perth in Scotland, where I live now. And
good for you. That's great.
And so I started learning to fly in 2002 with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old underfoot. And I was at that point really a stay-at-home mom. Well, I'm still a stay-at-home mom, but
how old are your kids now?
They're 23 and 20.
Hopefully you don't have to mom as much.
when they were 4 and 2 and they were underfoot, and I was trying to do my ground school studying and trying to memorize stuff for how you do a practice course landing. It was hard work. It was really hard work.
Yeah, been there.
And it took me longer than it takes most people.
Yeah.
Like it took me a year and a half. And by the time I finished, when I got my PPL, I had exactly the same number of hours as my husband had when he flew across Kenya.
Did you feel qualified to fly across Kenya at that point?
No, I was just like, oh my God.
That's great. Then you really put it together.
Yeah.
And you guys, don't you own a plane?
No, well, we did many years ago. My husband had a share in a plane before we had children, and that was a Robin 200, little 2-seater French plane, which was a lovely little plane. But it was, upkeep on your own plane it was a money suck and a time suck, particularly after we had kids and we never really used it. It was only a 2-seater anyway. So now we just hire aircraft. We're both general aviation, basic PPLs. My husband has instrument rating, and he has a lot more hours than I do. He has like 700 hours, I think.
Well, you've been locked away writing.
Yeah, but he's done a ton of flying, and I've done some flying with him. So I'm no longer current, and what I do now is we go flying together, and I take the controls.
Good for you.
After
That's
takeoff,
great.
and I fly until it's time to land, and then
That's awesome.
then he takes over. We've done a ton of flying this year. It seems to be something that we're able to do.
And up there, you're in Scotland, so it must be just gorgeous.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. And actually, and very empty. It was a really easy place to learn to fly. And as a result, I am kind of uncomfortable with bigger airports and, with having to follow protocol for having other aircraft.
Let me tell you something. I flew in and out of Bravo airspace for 8 years of my career. On active duty flying for the Coast Guard. Now that I'm paying to fly, I want to be at an airport where there's nobody else in the pattern.
Right.
So I'm going to come out and fly with you, because I don't want to deal with the chaos and the time that it takes to wait to, for clear for takeoff. And I don't want to do that.
The other thing that's really nice about flying here is that it's certainly where we are, it's very hard to get lost. You can go from one side of the country to the other in probably an hour and a half, and the landscape is so distinctive in the central belt of Scotland, with the Highlands north of you and the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde to the south, that it's really, really difficult to get lost.
I can't wait to see it. I'm coming out to see you for sure. So you were doing historical research before, when you weren't writing about flying. And so tell me about that transition, and then let's talk about these ladies who flew on the European front. Tell me about all that.
Well, I was working on a PhD in folklore. My background is all very literary. I have a degree in English. I have 2 degrees in folklore. And that's kind of where I learned to do research. And I actually, for one reason or another, had to give somebody my AP test scores recently, and I couldn't remember what I'd taken. And I looked them up, and I'd taken, these are my 3 AP tests: English, like language, literature, and writing, American history, and European history.
There you go. That makes total sense.
It was meant to be. I didn't remember taking European history as an AP course, but there you go. And so I was obsessed with King Arthur, and I was a big fantasy reader when I was a teen. And I started, spinning my own tales based on what I was reading. And when I started learning to fly, I was in the middle of writing this Arthurian series, but I really, really wanted to write about flying. It was just kind of like eating at me that I needed to be writing about flying, to the point where I started putting all these kind of like jab in the ribs kind of puns and jokes into the books that I was writing. So I have one character who, there's a chapter that's called A Dog Fight, and it's sort of a joke. And then there's a character who is a pilot. He's like a river pilot. But
you were going to work it in there, whether there were pilots like, flying or not.
I was going to get in there.
So
and so what I had an editor who was kind of trying to think of innovative ways to showcase her authors. And one thing that she did was she put together a series of anthologies. And I wrote a short story for the first one of these, which was about flying. And it's the first story that I wrote about flying that was published. And I think it was published in like 2003 or something like that. And it was about our trip across Kenya. So it was fiction, but it was based on that flight, and it was set in the early 1950s, which was a very turbulent time in Kenyan history. And that was my first short story, and it was from the point of view of a passenger. And I then wrote another short story for a different anthology from the point of view of a passenger who has a pilot who's making poor decisions and has to kind of take control, not of the plane, but of the decision making. It's called Chain of Events. So the passenger in the small plane has to like get in there and break the chain herself. And then the next short story that I wrote, and as I'm writing these, I'm like progressing through my own experience at the controls of an aircraft. The next short story that I wrote was from the point of view of a pilot. And this was about a girl who disguises herself as her dead brother and becomes a Spitfire pilot during the Battle of Britain. And I had always been a little bit obsessed with World War II, although I hadn't written about it before. And it kind of shocked me. I was always really interested in the civilian side of things. So like the home front and the resistance and people who were forced into concentration camps. And it surprised me that when I finally wrote a story about World War II, it was like about somebody flying in combat. But I wrote that story, and it was very well received in the anthology in which it was published. And my editor asked me if I would consider writing a novel, if not actually based on it, but drawing on the same time period and you know, featuring maybe a woman pilot. And what came out after a while was Codename Verity. And Codename Verity is about a pilot and a spy, and they're both young women, and their friendship. And that's kind of what it is at the base, but it is constructed as a confession by the character who is a spy. And she sort of tells the story of the character who is the pilot, and it all comes to a big, terrible climax at the end, as you know, because I think you've read it.
I have, and I love it.
But but it really did sort of like, it was the culmination of a lot of different things that made it just sort of like all come to the forefront. And in many ways, it was also based on a story that I'd made up when I was like 12 years old, where there is the heroine is captured and is in the resistance and has this like antagonistic relationship with her interrogator. And so it was a very comfortable place for me to be writing, even though I knew a lot more than I did when I was 13. And it, because it kind of made my name and changed my life, it also produced an expectation that I was going to produce more of the same stuff. And okay. I find that there's quite a bit of pushback when I suggest writing, say, fantasy or an environmental thriller or whatever. You know, they're like, no, we want more women pilots. But it's
we
also,
want more women pilots.
Meant that, well, I mean, we do want more women pilots, but we want to read about women pilots too. Yes. And it's also meant that I've had people come to me and say, can you give us, in 2018, 2019, I had 3 books published, and they were all commissioned. I mean, so a couple of them were mine. One of them was work for hire, and one was nonfiction. One was special sort of niche short fiction for dyslexic readers, and one was a Star Wars book. But they were all, I was asked to write them as a result of being this person who, you know, specializes in writing fiction or historical stuff about women pilots. So, but yeah, that's something that, like, it's now defined me. I didn't mean that to happen.
Well, we're grateful it did, because you come to it not only with your skill for writing, but also with your skill for doing this historical research. Tell us about the groups specifically of women that you have written about, and then how you've done the research to make these gorgeous fiction stories.
Well, I do tend to do most of my research in the same way. I read. I exhaustively try to compile the literature. And of course, there's a ton available on the internet now with interviews of actual people who lived and breathed these things. But mostly I do my research by reading. The first group of women that I wrote about, the air transport auxiliary pilots, they were auxiliary to the Royal Air Force, and they did ferry and transport work for them in the UK while World War II was going on. A fun fact about the ATA, the Air Transport Auxiliary, is that they were the first British government organization to pay women and men equally, which they did from 1943, which I think is cool.
That is impressive.
I found out about them while I was writing the short story about the Spitfire pilot. And I thought, I think I kind of ended that story by saying, oh, you might be able to join the ATA when she's no longer a Spitfire pilot. And so that was what kind of gave me the seed. I went to this museum exhibit at the Imperial War Museum in London that was focusing on women in war. And it had displays on the ATA, which I hadn't known about before. This was it was in 2004, early 2004. And so that was eye-opening to me. And they probably had some information there about the Russian women who flew as combat pilots, because I knew about them when I started writing Codename Verity. I don't know when I first knew about them. They've been on my radar as long as women in aviation has been on my radar. And so that first group of women I've written about is the ATA. Obviously, they were not here in the UK. They were a civilian organization like the WASP were in the US. But unlike the WASP, there were also men who flew for the ATA. So
right.
Pilots who were disabled in some way, or were too old to join the Royal Air Force, or had been civilian pilots beforehand, or whatever, would join the ATA. And I believe that the ratio was about 8-2. So about a fifth of the ATA pilots were women, which is, a pretty good number.
Yeah,
I
better
mean,
than we're doing in most places. Yeah, better than we're doing in most places, for
that's
sure.
Right. So I actually had, when I was working on Codename Verity, was wondering how I could get these Russian women in there, because I knew about them. And I really felt that I didn't know enough about Russia. I didn't know enough about growing up in the Soviet Union, and about what it is like to be culturally Russian, to be able to tell a story from the point of view of one of these women. And what ended up happening was somebody asked me to write nonfiction about them. And I felt that I could do that because I could do the research and I could write it, as a Westerner, without, bringing whatever sensitivity I was able to it, but without trying to get into the heads of these women. And of course,
Right.
as I started doing research for it, I discovered that I kind of did need to get into their heads. As I was researching it, I became fascinated by what really drove them to want to do what they did. And I ended up doing a lot more background research on the Soviet Union and what made its people tick in the 1930s, to try to understand this generation that was so eager to defend its country. And I'm kind of talking here as if everybody knows what I'm talking about. These are the women that you will most often hear them referred to as the night witches. They weren't all called that, there were three groups of Soviet women who flew in combat in the Second World War, and they were all under the same commander. And one of these groups were flying these training aircraft that were, basically made out of balsa wood and fabric, and were harassing German encampments on the front at low level in the middle of the night. And those are the ones who ended up being called the Night Witches. And they were not the only unit flying these planes who were doing that. They were one of hundreds of similar units. They just happened to be the only female unit. And they actually organized themselves in such a way that they were very, very successful, which is the remarkable thing about them. And people tend to think that they were given the terrible planes because they were women. That was not the case. The Russians were using whatever planes they had for, whatever pilots they had. But they also had a unit that was a fighter unit, and they also had a dive bomber unit. And the dive bombers were flying these really very state-of-the-art aircraft, which took a crew of three. So a pilot, a navigator, and a rear gunner. And they ended up having to fly in mixed air crews because women didn't have the upper body strength required to reload these guns in flight. So you could do it on the ground, but not in flight. And there was one woman who had like road crew or something like that, who was able to do it. She was like the only female air gunner in this regiment. But yeah, they did amazing things, and the story itself is an amazing story. So I've written about them. I've written, as I say, nonfiction about them. And so one of my shorter books is also about them, my shorter books for teens, which is called Firebird. The nonfiction book is called 1,000 Sisters. So if you want it easy to read history because it's aimed at teens, 1,000 Sisters tells you all about the Soviet women who flew in the Second World War. And the other group that I think we've mentioned is German test pilots, which isn't really a group. It's kind of like two. And the most famous of these is Hannah Reich, who was just quite a character and very close to the inner circle of the Fuhrer. And another of my shorter novels, which is actually just coming out in March of this year, is called The Last Hawk, and it's about a young girl a German girl who is a glider pilot and ends up working with Hannah Reich on some propaganda. And just it's a very short book, but it gives you a little bit of insight into some of the secret projects that the Luftwaffe was working on, which are all really whack. and just the incredible kind of like the crazy mindset, the tunnel vision that afflicted those who were kind of entranced by Hitler and the Third Reich. So you asked about research as well. I was very lucky in researching the Russian women, in that a ton of them, when after Stalin died and when things started relaxing a little bit, a ton of them started telling their stories, and they told their stories in interviews, and they wrote memoirs, and a lot of these were translated into English. And then there was this nifty little exchange where some of the WASP went across and met them, 40 years later. And there was a woman called Anna Nagel who was a WASP and wrote, as I'm sure you know, and wrote a book, A Dance with Death, in which she went and interviewed like 40 of these women who were at that point still alive, and got them to tell her their stories through the help of a translator. So there's a lot of primary material available, even for me who doesn't read Russian.
That's great. That's great. In fact, at least one, if not a couple of those women were at the Women in Aviation International Conference when I went back in like 2009, 10.
Very cool.
Yeah, we would have a flight suit social for military women, and they
Yeah.
would show up to that.
Oh, that's so
Really
cool.
cool. Yeah,
I'm really jealous.
Goosebumps to even say that. Yeah, really cool. So yeah, I think we're probably nearing the end of that era of
Yeah,
our
I
women.
think there's one, and she's
Thankfully,
in very. Oh no, I think she may have just died.
that's so
Anyway.
sad. But it's lovely that we've been able to memorialize them both through,
Yeah.
first person accounts and then also through fiction. So it's wonderful. I was hoping that you would read a passage from one of your books.
When I went to look for an appropriate passage to read, I have got 5 minutes worth of reading here. Is that going to be too much?
It's fine. People have control over their remotes and phones, and if they get bored,
Okay.
I will be here to listen.
Okay.
No, please
What
do.
I decided to do was to read to you from 2 different books. I tried to pick passages that were sort of iconic in terms of showing you what these women were doing. So the first one is from this book, Rose Under Fire, which is about an ATA pilot in World War II who is intercepted over Germany after the invasion of Normandy and ends up behind enemy lines, and they don't really know what to do with her because they didn't expect her that she was going to turn out to be a woman when they got her back on the ground. And so they sent her to the concentration camp at Ravensbrück, which was the big German women's concentration camp for political prisoners mostly. And so a goodly chunk of this book is actually about the concentration camp at Ravensbrück. There is a Soviet combat pilot in here who the main character Rose meets in the camp. So that was my first, venture writing about one of these women. But the passage that I'm going to read to you is really just a kind of sample of the sort of flight that an ATA pilot would be making. So this is from the point of view of the title character, Rose, and she is ferrying her uncle, who's a high up official in the Royal Engineers, and she's ferrying him to some place that he needs to go for a meeting. And she tells the story of the flight that they have together. So it's a diary entry, and it's labeled August 7th, 1944, Ladies' Sitting Room, Prestwick Aerodrome, Scotland. I'm waiting for Uncle Roger to get out of his meeting. I have decided it is a good idea to take this notebook with me in case I get stuck somewhere again, like last week at Maid's-End, so I have something to do. We had a heck of a time getting here. We had to fly through a hailstorm that came out of nowhere. It sounded like we had our heads in a bucket that was being pelted with rocks. I don't know when I've ever been so frightened while flying. Roger seemed to be all unconcerned. He was in the back, in the middle of a cigarette, with his legs up on the second pilot seat. The aircraft is a Proctor, not very big. Along with the hail came a bit of wind shear bumping us around, which made him accidentally kick me. I snapped angrily, "Could you please put your feet down?" It's amazing what a short, sharp command, instantly obeyed, does for your morale. I was absolutely not going to let him know how worried I was. He didn't stretch out his legs again for the rest of the flight. After we landed and I was taxiing off the runway, I said, "Sorry about the bumpy ride." When I switched off the engine, he reached over my shoulder and shook my hand. "You're a damned fine pilot, Rosie," he said. "A real credit to your father. For a moment there, I thought we were being hit by machine gun fire." I took a deep breath and let myself clench my fists at last, just to get the tension out of them. Daddy never let me hold tight to the control column. He used to make me control it with one finger, just to practice the light touch. I do it automatically now, but it sure does feel good to squeeze your hand shut after a flight like that. "Is that what machine gun fire sounds like?" I asked. Pretty much. Didn't you notice me looking around wildly for the Messerschmitt that was firing on us? I thought we'd had it. Ready to go down fighting, though. He held up his other hand. He'd got out his pistol. Here was me thinking he hadn't been worried. Gee whiz, Uncle Roger, it was just bad weather. And that's what kills most ATA pilots, right? You kept your head and got us down safely. I always say there's no other pilot I'd rather have in control of my plane. Except your dad, of course. He laughed and unstrapped his harness and put away his pistol. Ready to take me to France someday soon? I unlatched the door. Uncle Roger, if you can engineer getting me to fly you to France, you really are a royal engineer. They don't let any ATA pilots go to France yet, and when they do, it'll be the men. Roger gave his characteristic humph of disgust. There were American women on the beaches of Normandy 4 days after D-Day. Army Nurse Corps, plucky girls carrying all their own gear, just like the lads. And our British ladies began to arrive only a few days later. They're at the front now or just behind it. I know you're civilian pilots, but at least in a plane you can scarper home when you've dropped me off. You're preaching to the choir, Uncle Roger. I hauled myself out onto the wing and reached back in so he could pass me our bags. If you pull the strings, I'm ready to go. I don't believe he really can pull those strings, but it gives me a warm, excited feeling in the pit of my stomach that he thinks he can and might actually try. So that's Rose, and her kind of twangy all-American girl feel is because she is actually American. Her uncle is English, and I should have maybe told you that before I started. But anyway, that's Rose, the ATA pilot, before she lands herself in Deep
I
Water.
loved it because you captured like essence of flying. Like you're teaching us not only about history but about flying, but doing it in a fictional way. So it's you don't even realize that you're learning something. That's a unique skill that I have been working very hard to master in fiction writing. It's beautiful.
Well, and that's partly why I chose that section, because it's got flying and it was like to be flying, but it's also got, a little bit of information about, what was actually going on with women at that point in the war. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, and then there are ways in writing where that can feel clunky, but yours not at all ever.
Oh, thank you.
People can do that poorly, and you certainly don't. So it's wonderful. So what's
so
next?
This next bit that I'm going to read you is really just Selfindulgence, and it's from Codename Verity. And this was a bit that I really thought that the editors would make me cut, because it's what John Steinbeck calls hoop-de-doodle. It's just the author enjoying herself. And it turns out that like this is one of the most quoted passages in the book. I see this turning up on people's blogs all the time.
See, your passion just comes right through. That's when
it's
really good.
So in this we have well, it's kind of self-explanatory really, but it's talking about the ATA pilot who is one of the two main characters in this book. Days before Britain declared war on Germany, Maddie flew by herself to the other side of England, skimming the tops of the Pennines and avoiding the barrage balloons like silver ramparts protecting the sky around Newcastle. She followed the coast north to Bamborough and Holy Island. The sun still sets quite late in the north of England in August, and Maddie, on fabric wings, flew low over the long sands of Holy Island and saw seals gathered there. She flew over the great castle crags of Lindisfarne and Bamborough to the north and south, and over the ruins of the 12th century priory, and over all the fields stretching yellow and green towards the low Cheviot hills of Scotland. Maddie flew back following the 70-mile, 2,000-year-old dragon's back of Hadrian's Wall to Carlisle, and then south through the Lakeland Fells along Lake Windermere. The soaring mountains rose around her, and the poet's waters glittered beneath her in the valleys of memory, hosts of golden daffodils, swallows and amazons, Peter Rabbit. She came home by way of Blackstone Edge above the old Roman road to avoid the smoke haze over Manchester, and landed back at Oakway, sobbing with anguish and love. love for her island home that she'd seen whole and fragile from the air in the space of an afternoon, from coast to coast, holding its breath in the glass lens of summer and sunlight, all about to be swallowed in nights of flame and blackout. Maddie landed at Oakway before sunset and shut down the engine, then sat in the cockpit weeping.
Hang on, give me a second. Well, yeah, you certainly do that well.
Thank you. Yeah, I do like that. I do like that passage. And I did this tour. It was a round the world trip, and there were a number of legs to it. It wasn't like one publisher sending me on a round the world trip, but I incorporated a bunch of different things into it. And so I was gone for a month. I took off from Edinburgh, flew to Australia. From there, went to Los Angeles. From there to Toronto and the East Coast, and with a stint back to Vancouver, and from there back to Edinburgh. And I think I had to change planes in London, and then I took another flight, a domestic flight from London back up to Edinburgh. And I'd been away for a month, and I'd been around the world. And it was a beautiful, beautiful, clear day. And from 30,000 feet or whatever we were at, I could see both sides of the country as we flew back. I could see from Newcastle to Glasgow. And I was just like, it's just, oh my gosh, look at it, it is small and it's so beautiful. So,
good, I'm glad I'm not the only one who gets weepy. That's wonderful. Oh, there's so many things to talk about writing, which we'll do in a minute and I'll have in a separate recording. You told us about the book that's just coming out. Are you working on anything now?
Sorry, that's this one.
That's the one that's coming out, The Last Hawk. Okay.
Yeah.
Did we talk about all of your books? Because there are 7 of them now. There'll be 8 that feature. I'm gonna have the book covers. Although I need to add The Last Hawk. Perhaps I might not have that one yet.
You know, the one that we've missed. I would say the one that we've missed. Well, besides the Star Wars one,
which I still can't get my hands on,
is this one.
Yes, you have a book about women wingwalkers.
Yeah.
It's not about that, but it features women wingwalkers in the 1920s, 30s.
Yeah. So this is really a book about Ethiopia. And it's about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And the way I framed it was from the point of view of an American family who moves there and happens to be there during the time. And it's a blended family, we would call it now. It's an atypical family as well. So it's made up of the mother who learned to fly kind of with Vesey Coleman in France, and with the young girl who had been hired to go along to France with her as her maid, and who kind of became her best friend. And they both learned to fly in France. And when they leave France, they put aside all this whole, like, she's my maid business, because like the woman whose name is Rhoda doesn't want a maid anyway. This is something that her parents forced on her. And they become a double act. And they are barnstormers. And they are Black Dove and White Raven, because one of them is white and one of them is black. And they each have a baby. And Rhoda's baby is by this Italian pilot who she is married to. And her kind of soulmate, Delia's baby, is by a guy who was like a secretary to an Ethiopian noble who was learning to fly at the same club in France where they were flying. And the story is from the point of view of these two kids as they grow up. Delia is killed in a boat strike. And so Rhoda ends up looking after these kids and raising them herself. And she decides she's fed up with segregation and with the prejudice that Theo, who she considers to be her son at this point, is having to face as he grows up in 1920s, 1930s America. So she wants to take him and take them all to live in the wonderful kind of like idealized place of his ancestors, which is Ethiopia. And they go there and stuff goes down. But she teaches her kids to fly. That she's also a nurse. And so she's kind of like making a life for herself there as a flying doctor and as a photographer. And she does all this different stuff. She's very, very idealistic. And she's also a little bit loopy. But the story is told from the point of view of her kids as they're learning to fly, as they grow up in Ethiopia, and as they watch their country falling apart, their adopted country falling apart around them. So it's like out there on a limb as far as my other books are concerned. It won the Children's Africana Book Award, which is nice.
That is lovely. And I love the way that you just weave the aviation into all of your other interests. That's fabulous. So are there any groups of women in aviation history that you want to explore that you haven't had the opportunity?
I just keep finding out more about people that I had never heard about before. I'm very, very interested in minority pilots. And I kind of keep a list of people that I would like to write about, both men and women. And I mean, that kind of grows out of being a woman pilot, you know, being the only woman learning to fly in the airfield where I learned to fly in 2003. I mean, how is that?
That's a great question. We're all asking ourselves that, yeah.
So yeah, it kind of grew out of that. But I just keep running into more people all the time. I forget what rabbit hole I went down, but I discovered these French women who were flying for the French Air Force at the beginning of World War II. And then there were these Spanish women who were flying during the Spanish Civil War. And the White Squadron, who I'd never heard of until this year.
Me too, actually.
Yeah, who were a Romanian group flying into the Battle of Stalingrad to do ambulance work for the Germans. So I mean, there's just like it's a never-ending treasure trove, really.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you for preserving the parts that you have already and for the ones that you're going to explore in the future. We're so grateful for your work and so excited to read all of your books. I've only read a couple so far, but I have a long list of books. And I hope so we've talked about your body of work on the whole today, but I hope to delve deeply into an individual novel at some point in the future. So we'll definitely plan to do that. Thank you for being with me for the first part of this. Thank you for sharing your work with us.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I love talking about my books. It feels self-indulgent to be talking so much about myself. But you know,
but you're not.
Interviewing
you're talking
me,
about,
so
you're not just talking about yourself. You're talking about all these women in aviation history.
And they're so fascinating. And I guess what I feel like, it's not really fair for you to say, oh, thank you for writing about these people. It's been my pleasure to write about these people, you know, and I want so much to share all the amazing things that they've done. So thank you for reading.
Thanks so much for listening. Please check back later this month when I'll be interviewing Sarah Byrne Rickman, who is the author of almost a dozen nonfiction biographies featuring the women air service pilots from World War II, as well as Rocky Ramsey and her co-author Trisha Arend about their new book, The Nadine Ramsey Story. Blue skies.
And here I am, I'm ready to go again. I'm ready to say